All right, welcome to the show. Today, our guest is Dan Rosenheim. He has spent a long career across the industry, the media side, journalism, spent many years in San Francisco as a news director for a couple of major TV stations there. Dan, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
So first off, as a journalist, as a director, a news director at these TV stations, you probably got pitched all the time for all kinds of stories. What was the one thing in particular that would drive you crazy in pitches?
Oh, I don't know that there was any one thing that drove me crazy, but certainly hype doesn't work. You learn to respect public relations professionals who are straight with you. I always said the PR people who did the best were the ones who took the trouble to get to know journalists. Because if you have a personal contact, you're more inclined to listen, to take a pitch, to take it seriously, to take an argument seriously or an approach seriously. But yeah, hype doesn't really get you very far, but straightforward pitches, I look at all of them.
So you don't love the words, exclusive, revolutionize, changing the world, breathtaking, groundbreaking, all that stuff that we usually see in these pitches.
We got a great product. Well, if you're going to use it, you better back it up. You know, exclusive is a word that any journalist likes if it really is exclusive. If I had to boil down what motivates me and many other journalists as much as anything else, it's scoop. We love to get news that people don't already know. So if I can get something first or get something alone, I'm very, very happy. You can sell me on an exclusive, but it has to be that.
Scoop, that's an even better word. Shorter, one syllable, fewer letters, means something powerful. I like that. People aren't using the word scoop enough.
TV word.
Exactly. So tell me about the idea of working in the Bay Area, but not being in the tech industry, right? Like so much of, I'm in New Jersey, I sit not in San Francisco. So much of the conversation when someone talks about the Bay Area in the media world or the industry world, they just think tech. But you were part of that. You were reporting on it. You were seeing it. What was that experience like to be an outsider, even within your own backyard, from that industry that's taking over the world?
Well, it's changed tremendously in the time I've been here. I came here in 1985 from Chicago. And the first thing that struck me moving here from a Chicago newspaper was that, if you will, the leitmotif, the kind of defining issue in Chicago, above and beyond everything else in the 1980s, was race. Whether you were talking about jobs, you were talking about housing, you were talking about politics, you had a city that was very divided along racial lines, and that was a question that came up again and again and again. When I got to the Bay Area, the big topic here was growth. How do we manage growth in a way that preserves the unique beauty and charm of this area? Do we drill offshore for oil? How tall should buildings be downtown? It came up in so many ways. Silicon Valley at the time was already a pace setter in terms of its impact on the economy and its impact on the world of work, but it had a legacy of very expensive housing, clogged roads, groundwater pollution. So that was also an aspect of growth.
Even in 1985.
Even in 1985. Now it's obviously evolved. The whole tech debate has become much more complex. I was talking to a woman the other day, I did an interview with a woman named Radia Perlman, who's one of the founders of the internet. And at the end of the interview, I said, well, how do you feel about the internet? And she said, 10 years ago, I would have told you it was the most wonderful thing that had ever come along. You can go all over the world with it. You can see pictures all over the world. You can talk to anyone. You can buy anything you want, anywhere you want. She said, today, I think it's the end of civilization. I'm not sure I endorse that view, but I thought it was pretty interesting comment from someone who's as responsible as anyone for the internet as we know it today. And clearly the debate has evolved now to become a profound discussion about how we communicate, how we're informed.
It's funny you mentioned Radia Perlman. That's a blast from the past, that name. Her son went to MIT. He was in the room next to mine.
Is that right?
Like 20 years ago. Yep. Ray was her son. And so we had a lot of fun stories about, his parents had done a lot in terms of the technology industry, before we were even born. So that's fun that you're talking to Radia. I mean, but you think about that, right? You go back 20 years, you go back 30 years, and what the internet was going to be was this opportunity for interconnectedness and people working together and harmonizing and global peace and all of this stuff. And now you talk to someone like Rady who says this is the end of civilization, not the beginning of the best part of civilization. And, and you've been part of that since you've been in San Francisco since 1985.
That's right. Everybody has a megaphone now. And we've seen
and not everyone should have a megaphone.
We've seen the decline of traditional media. I realized maybe 15 years ago, I took a Muni bus into work, got on with my morning newspaper, started to read it, looked around the bus, and I was the only one on it with a paper newspaper. That's not surprising today, but it was a shock to me 15 years ago when I realized it was coming to that. And so, traditional news media have declined. Television ratings are a fraction of what they once were. Newspaper circulation is a fraction. Newsrooms are much smaller. And we really don't know the answer to the question, how are we going to get our information and how are we going to make sure it's accurate?
Does anyone still need traditional media anymore? I think about a great example in San Francisco, Steph Curry, right? Plays for the Warriors. His own following, if you look at social media, his following is bigger than any news outlet in the area. So why does he need to tell his story through traditional media? He can tell the story directly without them.
He may not, but I guess my feeling is that for stories that report on our society, for stories that look under the carpet, if you will, that look at the layers of a story, look at the layers of an event or the complexity of people so that we understand it better, you need professional journalists and you need professional standards to curate that news. Steph Curry can tell his story, but maybe the way Steph Curry would tell it would be very different from the way a biographer would tell it or a reporter would tell it.
What do you see as the misconceptions of what's happening in these newsrooms, right? Everyone who's not in a newsroom, they only see the end product. They don't see the sausage being made. They don't see the decisions that happen invisibly before it gets to air. When you talk to normal people who are not part of the TV ecosystem, what is it that you find that you're constantly having to explain over and over again as a common misconception?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. I mean, clearly there are people, and there are not a few people in our country who believe the media are part of a vast conspiracy. I'm not sure that's what you're driving at, but I've had members of my family, and I joke with them. I say, oh yeah, when I go into the news meeting in the morning, I get my call from the CIA every day. There really is a profound belief that the mainstream media are corrupt. So that's a misconception with which we have to deal in our society right now. For people who aren't hostile to the media, I think there's a failure to understand how much work goes into doing a story, how much care goes into researching it, into checking it, into making sure it's fair and balanced, into editing it, and being prepared to be accountable for it.
How did someone go from newspaper writer to TV executive?
In 1996, I'd been managing editor or city editor of the Chronicle, those two jobs, for 9 years. I'd been a reporter for 9 years before that. And I started thinking, what am I going to do to keep growing? Being the managing editor of the Chronicle was a great honor. I loved being there. I loved the newspaper. I still do. But I was looking for a new challenge. And I thought, if I don't really mess up, I could probably stay in management at the Chronicle for the rest of my life. But wouldn't it be fun to do something different? And we got involved in a shared project with KRON TV. We did coverage of a political campaign together. We did a broadcast live debates for the gubernatorial race. And I was struck for really the first time by the power of television when I got involved in producing those debates. And I thought it would be really interesting to learn to do news in a different medium from the one with which I've worked. Well, be careful what you wish for. I reached out to KRON. Initially, they were not very interested in having a print guy come on board. But ultimately, the station manager said to me, you have a different background. You do news somewhere else. But I'm willing to take a chance on someone who brings a different perspective into our newsroom. So I landed in Cron, and it was a different world.
How long did it take you to realize, okay, maybe now I know what I'm doing now? 2, 3, 4 years? How long before? Okay,
I'm not sure I ever did. The differences are amazing. I kind of thought, well, a newsroom's a newsroom and management's management. So it'll be very similar to what I did at the Chronicle. But I failed to realize that the cultures are profoundly different. The Chronicle still was writing today's news for tomorrow. And at TV, you had to be prepared to go live all the time. Television's a performance medium. I used to joke that newspapers self-select for introverts and television self-select for extroverts. When I was in management at the Chronicle, someone would come to my office door and kind of look at the floor and scuff their feet and say, is there any chance I could get a little bit more money? And they run away before I could even answer it. In TV, they'd come to my office door and say, I deserve a raise. Why? Because I'm me. So there was a real difference in terms of the culture. I had to learn about going live. I had to learn about performance. I'll never forget, I'd been there for about 3 months and my assistant news director came running into my office and said, Dan, I've got a great lead for the 6 o'clock news. And I said, what is it, Lisa? And she said, we got this video and there are these sharks and they're attacking a whale just outside the Golden Gate. And I said, Lisa, sharks probably attack whales 1,000 times a day in the oceans of the world. Why is that a lead? And she looked at me and said, because we got the video. I'm still not sure it's a lead, but I began to understand the importance of sound and pictures, something that astonishingly, I hadn't really thought a lot about before I went to TV.
So let's say you made the switch in 96, if your LinkedIn's right, from the Chronicle to the TV station. So let's fast forward. Let's say it's 2021. You're working at the Chronicle. You're back to that age again, and you're wanting to do something different. Do you even go into TV? Do you go into the social media world? Do you go work for big tech, since big tech has become big media? Do you go to one of these subscription newsletter channels, like a Substack kind of place? It's so fragmented now. What would be that transition for a newspaper executive, a newspaper editor now?
It's very fragmented. And I'm not sure I know exactly what direction I might take had things been different or were I to do it again today. One option, though, would be to take the franchise and the equity that a newspaper has and try and carry it into the 21st century. An example of an institution that's done that very well is the New York Times, which of course has a brand and has a quality of news that not everyone has. But they've built an enormous digital subscriber base, and they remain financially viable and the closest thing to a paper of record we have in this country. The Journal's done that to some degree. The Post has done that to some degree. And I think the challenge for a paper like the Chronicle is how to take the hunger for real quality local news and package it and market it in a way that's financially viable.
What about individual reporters, individual writers, people that have a personal brand, but it's done through the newspaper, it's done through the TV network? They can't really port that anywhere, right? You can't own that. You can try, you can take it somewhere else, and hopefully you get the readership, you get the followers. The business model is changing for people like that, though, right? You can get your own social media platform that you take with you. You can get people to pay to subscribe to your writing. You can get people to pay to be on a specific newsletter. That you're starting to see journalists leaving big media altogether and controlling their own brands.
Yeah, you do see some of that. And we're in a period of rapid change, and I don't think any of us know exactly what it's going to look like. But there is a legitimacy that comes still, I think, from being associated with an institution. If the institution is vibrant, if the institution is changing to match the times. I know a columnist at the Chronicle, someone who worked there for a long time, who was able to take his brand and move into television while staying at the Chronicle and move into radio while staying at the Chronicle. But the Chronicle attachment for that person was very important, both in terms of his ability to get people to talk to him and in terms of his overall identity.
Right. You're saying the people that leave that all together, then they're just themselves. It's that.
Yeah, and you can get big enough, I suppose. People do get big enough that you can have a YouTube channel that commands tremendous following, or you can go to one of the paywall, subscription paid approaches to doing your own journalism, but it's not quite the same as being associated with a collective enterprise. It has clear standards.
On your LinkedIn page here, you worked for a year and a half, a subscription newsletter about ferry boat transit, waterfront briefing. Well, what is that? Why did you leave KPIX to do that?
Well, I really got to a point where I wanted to retire from full-time work. I put in, I left KPIX on the anniversary of my 18 years to the day of having come there. I'd been talking about retiring for a couple of years. Being a news director, as you know, is an all-consuming job. It's 24/7. The phone rings in the middle of the night. There's a big fire. Can we move the satellite truck? How much overtime can we spend? There constant HR issues and budget issues and journalism issues, and it's wonderful.
Oh, really? HR and budget issues, huh?
It's exciting and it's stimulating and it's wonderful and it's why we get into the business, but it's also exhausting. And after 22 years as a news director, 18 of them at the CBS affiliate, I decided I didn't want to do that full time anymore. So I left and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do a lot of hiking and play a little bit of tennis. And I knew I wanted to stay connected to journalism in one way or another, but I wasn't sure how. A friend of mine who is involved in water transit came to me and said, I need somebody to produce a regular newsletter about ferry boats. I don't know anything about ferry boats. I didn't know anything about ferry boats or anything about water transit, but I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. And it was wonderful. I lived in the Bay Area for 30 plus years and knew very little about the geographic phenomena that defines this region, the Bay. And so I got to find out about little nooks and crannies in the Bay and about the ferry service and how it operates and the finances of it and the technology of it and the possibilities of coming up with green ferries, as in ferry boats that are ecologically sound. And it was fun. And I did it for a year. And then I left. And a woman I know, Catherine Ann Rowlands, who had bought the regional wire service called Bay City News and was attempting to revive it. And I thought that might be an interesting thing to do too. So I'm working part-time for Cat and I'm doing a lot of different things. There are some young journalists right out of school who go to Bay City News, traditionally have gone to city news bureaus like that. And I do some mentoring with them and I edit some material. I'm also helping Cat revive her subscriber base as the media environment has shrunk and changed. A lot of traditional subscribers have gone away, although Bay City News is still subscribed to by all the TV stations and virtually every newspaper and news radio and so on. We've been able to add a lot of clients, not just in news, but also public relations firms, law firms, police agencies, government departments. So I've worked on that with her. And then I've just been kind of another grown-up in the room to help her with things like union negotiations.
What is it like going from the bigger companies, the established companies, to something that's a little more entrepreneurial, got a more of a younger feel to it, and you're bringing in all this veteran experience? Do you find, hey, they really want to hear what I have to say, or they're moving so fast that it's like, okay, he's in the room, but we don't really have to listen to him?
Probably a little of both. It's funny. I started thinking about retirement when I was at the station, and I'd go to the morning meeting, and every once in a while I would refer to something and people had no idea what I was talking about, or the younger people in the room would refer to something and I had no idea what they were talking about. So if people roll their eyes at me from time to time, I'm blissfully unaware. This has been a lot of fun working for the wire service. It's a different kind of experience, having worked for a newspaper and for a television station, working for a wire service that's nimble and it's lean and trying to grow it and trying to help where I can is really satisfying.
It's interesting. You said you guys were growing clients. It's actually in a growth mode right now. The wire service, it's one of those types of platforms that we don't give a lot of attention. Right? We talk about the TV stations and the newspapers and the other components of the media world. We don't really talk about the wire services, but you make a good point. They may be in the end the long-term survivor, because in the end there still needs to be that kernel of news before anyone else can aggregate, curate, comment, give an opinion, put photos on it, copy it. You need something to start, and maybe the wire service is the winner in the end.
Well, they're a little bit of a backbone for other news organizations. We publish a calendar. It's called Datebook, and it's the list of all the events that are going to happen today and tomorrow. Every press conference, every demonstration, every news release, every study that's released. So assignment desks and city desks look at it, and it helps to determine where they want to send reporters on any given day. So that's an extremely important component of what we do. And then, before people decide to assign someone to do some big, long, complex take, we provide basic news about events that are taking place.
From your vantage point there in the Bay Area, what is the story about these giant tech companies, the Googles, the Facebooks? I mean, these guys didn't even exist when you first got there, right? And they've gotten so big. They're the biggest companies in the world, the richest people in the world working there. Being in that city, in that area where they are, obviously not the city, but the area, what is the perspective that you have that you feel like the folks in New York and the folks in DC and the folks in the middle of America, when they think about these companies, they don't have the same perspective because they're not there in that ecosystem like you are?
Well, I don't know that we have a different perspective on the political issues that are being raised by technology, how it affects our society, whether it ought to be regulated, whether it ought to be broken up, monopolies. Those are, I think the view from New York and San Francisco are probably quite similar. The impact here is much more on the socioeconomics of the city. A huge infusion of young technology employees who make very, very good salaries, which has led to even greater economic polarization in the Bay Area, has made it virtually impossible for working class people to live in San Francisco or on the peninsula or anywhere close to the center of the Bay Area. That's the issue that technology is posing for our area.
Can I ask your own personal story? Like, can you afford to live in the house that you're in? Are you going to get crowded out at some point? What's the actual, that you and your friends and your neighbors, what's been that actual realized lived experience?
Well, we bought a house in 1987. And at the time, I thought, I don't know how I'm going to be able to make the mortgage. It was a stretch in 1987. At the time, I'd just become city editor, so I'd just gone into management. And it was a stretch to make the payments on my house. But today, that house is worth roughly 7 times what I paid for it.
Wow.
So my mortgage now, in the greater scheme of things, seems more reasonable. I've lived here for a long time. My mortgage is, in fact, just about paid for. And so I've been very lucky. I got in. And that's part of the trick to the housing market in the Bay Area. If you find a way to get in, then you stay in. Of course, I can sell my house, but once I do that, I'd have to move back to the Midwest.
And you sound like you don't want to do that.
Probably not. I like living here very much.
What are you seeing in terms of the regulatory atmosphere there in San Francisco? Because I think so much of when you hear the word San Francisco, you hear Bay Area, you hear California, people out in other parts of the country just think that's where all the crazy stuff happens. That's where weird rules happen. That's where they take things too far. You see, it's like, hey, go ahead and shoplift, right? It's fine now. Like you always, the image, the portrayal out on the East Coast is San Francisco is Looney Tunes. Do you see that? Do you live that?
Well, the city certainly has that reputation. It is a liberal city by and large, but no. I mean, clearly there is a parody of San Francisco that gets bandied about that isn't the reality. A video of someone shoplifting goes viral and everybody jumps on it and says, this is the way it is. It's not really like that. So, we're still an American city. We're still a diverse, interesting American city. It's a well-informed city. And as a result of that, for example, the COVID pandemic has had much less of an impact in the city. This is a city that shut down long before most places did. And you can't force people to do that. There was a mandate to stay home, but people voluntarily complied with it. And it had a very positive result.
Yeah, it's a good point. They were the first. I remember right before the NBA season shut down, they were going to have that Warriors game with no fans. And at the time it seemed, that's nuts. No fans. What is this? This is crazy. And then, of course, that became reality, right? That became reasonable. At least you get to have the game. But they were the first. You're right. That was going to be the first game that was going to have no fans.
Yeah. London Breed, the mayor, ordered that shut down, and she was out ahead of the curve.
you haven't been in that newsroom, in that TV newsroom for 3 years now. It's been a crazy 3 years, right? You've seen the presidential election, the California recall election. Maybe your anxiety levels, you got out at the right time because it would have gotten real crazy. If you were there these last 3 years, this 36 months, that day-to-day churn, what would you be doing differently right now? What would be the stories that you would want to focus on that maybe are getting underreported that you think, hey, we need to push this story to the front?
One of the things that's happened in TV newsrooms here is technologically driven and economically driven, which is the move toward multimedia journalism. Big TV newsrooms now ask their reporters to carry cameras. Many reporters go out and do live stand-ups that they put the camera on a tripod and do it themselves. And that's a process that began when I was still at KPIX, but it's accelerated. So the staffs are leaner, they're more efficient, but new technology allows us to do that. Cameras used to weigh 45 pounds and cost $40,000. And now people can shoot high quality video on a cell phone.
No, you're right. I remember in my time at CNBC, we would go out and do big stories and we would still have the traditional approach. I'm coming with a field producer, a cameraman, maybe there's an audio person, and depending on how big the shoot is or the project, there's a truck and there's multiple people. And there would be local reporters from other stations come and they would just carry on wheels. It looked like they're like airport, their airport luggage on wheels. And they would pull out their tripod and they would set it all up and they'd be all by themselves. And I remember thinking, man, I'm lucky because I don't have to do that. I don't really want to do that. Right. And kudos to them because they're busting it out.
The first time we did it, people looked down their nose at our reporters and our reporters felt terrible. Why did they get all those resources and we don't? But it's become much more common currency now.
And you're right, because management types, guys like you who are looking at those budgets will look around and say, hey, well, I think the output for those people was the same as the output for us. So why do we send 3 people when we can send 1?
When I first started at KRON in 1996, 97, you won the 11 o'clock news with a household rating of 8. Today, you win the 11 o'clock news with a household rating of about 1.8. So that tells you what's happened to the audience for traditional television news. TV still does really well when there's a big breaking story, a big major fire or some other major breaking story. But day in, day out news watching is not the same as it was 20 years ago. And that has an impact on budgets. So between that and the technology that allows you to operate in a much more mobile way, in a much more efficient way, we've moved forward.
What do you tell people who want to break into the on-air world? Because obviously a lot of people that get out of school, they start in the small market, they work their way up and up and up, and then they get to a place like, all right, San Francisco, you're in a major top 10 market in the country here. This is where careers are made. What do you tell the young women and guys that are trying to get their way up there and they're hoping with fingers crossed to break into a place like that?
Right. Well, I always say I'm the bad example of how to do it because I just jumped from newspapers with no experience into TV, and somehow I got lucky enough not to fall completely on my face. I think journalists, no matter what medium they're in, need to be good writers. And a lot of people think, well, TV is talking, it's not about good writing, but being able to construct a story, being able to put a story together and articulate it, but writing it is so important. That I advise people to work on doing that. And then clearly in this business, it helps to get to know people. If you want to break into a big market, there are all the obvious things that'll help you. Having a fine resume, doing good stories, being a good storyteller, performing well on television, producing a good newscast. But what often makes the difference is knowing somebody who's there, who knows it's a little like what I was saying about a PR person. If you've made a personal contact, it makes it easier to get a door open and get a hearing.
It's funny, it goes back because I was going to ask you about that here at the end. So what do you give the advice on those younger reporters that are trying to break in, they're trying to get good scoops, they want to get good stories, they want to make a name for themselves, and they're in that world working with PR people and they don't know who are the good ones? Who are the bad ones? How do I make sure I'm not being used to be the mouthpiece of a company? How do I make sure I'm actually really being diligent about the right kinds of stories? What is your advice to someone who's working their way up and they're trying to navigate what could be a very dangerous world if you don't play it right?
Well, PR people, like anyone else, establish reputations. So talk to other reporters. What do you think of so-and-so? Is that person a straight shooter? Is that somebody I can listen to? And use your own spider sense. You know when you're talking to somebody, whether they're feeding you a line or not. The given is that a public relations person is there to represent someone, a cause or a person. That's understood. That's what the job is all about. The question is, are they representing them in a way that's straightforward? Are they representing them in a way that's fundamentally honest? Are they selling you a story that holds water? Or are they just spinning and spinning and spinning? And we as journalists need to develop the ability to differentiate, but you do it in different ways, including finding out what someone's reputation is. How are they viewed by the journalism world?
And then lastly, before you go, the move from journalism to PR that a lot of people make, a lot of newspaper writers, a lot of TV professionals, they'll go into the representation side. What's been your experience watching your colleagues do that and seeing them on the other side, and your advice for them doing that? What have you noticed in that transition?
Well, a lot of times it's great because they understand both sides of the fence. They're doing, and that's probably one of the reasons why they get hired. They have contacts in the media, but they also know how the media work. They know what deadlines are about. They know how long it takes up to set up a shoot. They know whether it's reasonable for people to come out on a story or not. They know how to pitch a story because they were pitched too. So I think often journalists go into PR because journalists make good PR people and help enrich PR agencies with their experience and their knowledge.
Lastly, last question. This is the definite last question. What are you looking at the next 5 years when you look around the media world? What do you think's changing? Where do you see yourself? Where do you see this whole industry and Dan's place in it?
Boy, the only thing I feel for certain is that change is going to continue accelerating. If I knew what form it would take, I'd make a lot of money. Or we'd have the solutions to some real problems that we face as journalists. And I don't know what direction it's going to take. But I do know that we've gone through a period of tremendous change, and I don't see that stopping. I see it accelerating. And we're going to have to figure out what's the model that will allow us to present balanced, thoughtful, incisive, timely coverage that's in line with enduring principles that define good journalism.
Balanced, thoughtful, incisive, and timely. That's a hard thing to put together, right? That's 4 qualities that I don't know if someone's going to be able to crack that anytime soon. And I appreciate the time, valuable insights here. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me on. I enjoyed talking to you, Eric.